Welcome to Top 10 Administrative Mistakes on Microsoft SQL Server. My name is Kevin Kline. I'm the Director of Engineering Services at SQL SENTRY. In case you don't know anything about me, I've been an MVP since 2003. I was one of the initial, I guess you could say, one of the founders of the big SQLpass.org professional association, the Professional Association for SQL Server. And I was president for 4 years back in the early 2000s. I'm very active online. I write a lot of books and blogs and so forth. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at KE I blog at kevinekline.com, and I also have another kind of blogging website where I do a lot of content development for IT pros who need to work on their soft skills, things like leadership and influence. So check that out at foritpros.com. So what are we going to talk about today? Let's take a quick look. First, I'll tell you a little bit about SQL SENTRY, and then we'll run down a countdown of the top DBA mistakes on Microsoft SQL Server. Now, one of the kind of surprising things about the top mistakes that DBAs make on SQL Server databases is that it's often problems with attitude. It's problems with people. It's problems with the processes. It's not always the technology actually that gets us into trouble. So that's one of the kind of surprising and unusual things about the challenges that face DBAs on a daily basis. Back when I first wrote this slide deck, I did it with some contributions from some friends of mine who are also active in the Microsoft SQL Server community, people like Colin Stasiak and Mike Walsh and several others. So just wanted to give a tip of the hat to those friends of mine who helped out on this presentation, well, probably 5 or 6 years ago when we first put together some of this information. Now, just to tell you a little bit about the company I work for, we do lots of stuff for the community, lots of free things. And so I just wanted to point out that we do have a very, very popular free book known as the High Performance Techniques from Microsoft SQL Server that you can see there. It's $10 on the Amazon Web Store. You can have it for free if you send an email to sales@sqlsentry.net or if you email me. Also, I really recommend that everybody who writes any sort of Transact SQL code get yourself a free copy of this right here. That is the extremely popular Plan Explorer tool. So if you do any sort of work on SQL Server, then you're going to want a copy of that. And I like to point out that it's so free we don't even take your email address, so you won't get spammed if you in any way if you were to download Plan Explorer. However, just a word from my company, I don't think we spam people much anyway, so we're not like a lot of those other companies that will hit you with endless amounts of emails or call you frequently trying to sell things to you. A few other things to note. This and all of the other webcasts that I've done are going to be available online after the fact at, you'll be able to see it here at SQL SENTRY TV. So I always post these out there before long. You'll be able to get the slide deck as well as any scripts. This particular presentation doesn't have a lot of scripts, but you would be able to get those if we had any scripts going on. So some other things too, there's an awesome blog at sqlperformance.com. A variation of sqlperformance.com is answers.sqlperformance.com, where we also post, you can post actually your own queries, your execution plans for your queries, and we'll help troubleshoot and tune those for you. And then finally, I do a monthly newsletter with tips and tricks and news about the company. Again, it's not very sales oriented at all, so if you want a few new tips and tricks every month, do subscribe or read that online. Now, the only part that's actually a commercial in this whole presentation is where I take just a moment and tell you a little bit about our tools. We have a complete range of tools for Microsoft SQL Server and Windows. So we do monitoring and performance tuning on SQL Server. And there's a number of different products that do that. We have Event Manager, which is the industry's only very advanced kind of event management system that lets you look at your SQL servers using an Outlook style calendar view, as well as the traditional list views and things like that. We've got Fragmentation Manager, which is a component of our Plan Explorer tool, which gives you all kinds of deep information about execution plans. And then we also have not just Performance Advisor, which you can see in the top part, but we have it more richly for all of the other SQL Server components in the Microsoft stack. So other companies might just monitor SQL Server. We give you everything, including analysis services and integration services, reporting services. And as you can see, this is our dashboard. It's kind of blurry, but it shows things in a dashboard-like interface. And if you ever want a demo, or you'd like a walkthrough or an eval, again, just drop me an email, or you can email sales, but you can drop me an email at kline@sqlsentry.net. And there's an example of one of our most popular tools, as I mentioned before. This is the difference between Management Studio on the top and SQL Sentry Plan Explorer on the bottom, where you can see in red, orange, and yellow the most important, medium, and somewhat cautionary things you need to take a look at in your execution plan. All right, so before I jump into the mistakes that I'm going to talk about in this webcast, don't forget that I said the top 10 administrative mistakes. So there's lots of other mistakes that we might make on SQL Server that aren't specifically the domain of a database administrator. So these are things like database design sorts of things. We haven't done any normalization, or we haven't done scalability or something like that. We haven't done any requirements testing of that nature. Maybe we've never run a benchmark or a baseline, and so we don't know what our hardware can actually sustain. And so we start to have all kinds of problems with that. Another sort of design issue is just ignorance about indexes and perhaps how those play into things like foreign keys and primary keys, database design, data types. And then finally, this is not a session about query tuning. So that's a big world. In fact, we already have more than 6 hours worth of training on SQL Sentry TV, recorded videos about query tuning. In fact, now that I think of it, I added a couple more. So there's almost 10 hours of that on our website. So we're not going to cover any kind of query tuning things, since that's more in the domain of database programmer as opposed to administrative sorts of issues. So we're going to leave out those things, and we're going to jump right in to the top 10 mistakes that DBAs make. The first mistake that I see happen everywhere, and keep in mind, I've been a SQL Server DBA since before SQL Server was a Windows product. I was an Oracle guy for 6 years in the late 80s and early 90s, and then I became a SQL Server person around 1994 to 1995, and so we were looking at a new OS called Windows, and so before Windows even became a thing, we started to look at SQL Server, which ran on Windows when it was an OS2 product, which was an operating system that IBM put out at the time. And one of the things that I've seen over the years, even today, as cheap as hard disks are by comparison, is that DBAs only think of their I/O subsystem in terms of the disks, and in particular in terms of how much the disks cost. So, if my disks are going to run out of space, I'm really attentive to that, and I'm paying a lot of attention. But I don't pay much attention to the amount of I/O load that's being placed on those. And that's a real shame, because that is entirely within our control, unless you just don't want to control it. Even if there is a SAN administration group, a storage area network group at your company, and they are supposed to take care of all of the hard disk needs and storage needs of your enterprise, you still have a high degree of control over it. You just might not know it. If you don't pay attention to I/O, you might have things like inadequate fault tolerance. You might be given two disks with RAID 1 mirroring, not knowing that it's possible to have more than one disk fail at a time, and so your mirror can fail. You might be given entirely RAID 5. And RAID 5, even on a SAN, RAID 5 is adequate for read. Its read speeds are quite good, but RAID 5 is terrible at write performance. So you might be given something that is very, very bad for the application that you have on hand. Keep in mind that with online transaction online transaction processing, OLTP, we are looking for high transaction rates per second. With OLAP, which is online analytical processing, we are looking for high megabyte transfers per second. So this latter one would be things like an ETL application or a big BI application that is reading an enormous data warehouse or cube, that's many terabytes in size. So we want that to have very high sustained megabyte transfer speed. We want the OLTP systems that are, inserts and updates and deletes to have high discrete transactional throughput. And the good news for us is, whether it's a SAN or a hard disk, is that all of these things, all of those products have published benchmarks on what their transaction rate per second is and their megabyte transfer rate per second. So you should not be in the dark on any of this stuff. And if you are, well, you're falling into that trap of one of the major DBA mistakes. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that SSDs are a game changer when it comes to I/O. Now, I'm talking about solid state disks here. You may have heard of products like Fusion I/O, for example. And so you're able to put in an all flash or an all DRAM component that is not a hard disk. And this not only makes I/O almost disappear in terms of problems. Now, of course, if you have super high throughput systems, you may still have I/O challenges even with SSDs. But this makes so many things go away. When you consider the design of a hard disk, so here's a hard disk over on the right hand side of the page as I look at it. And here we have the armature, and these are called the platters. The platters have cylinders which radiate like spokes from a wheel, and on each of these cylinders we have sectors. And this armature has to move back and forth over this spinning platter to read the bits on the platter as it spins. And thinking about that, that's one of the main reasons why we spend so much time making sure that our indexes are properly defragmented, because if this spinning disk has to, or the armature on the spinning disk has to, read a sector here and then write a sector there and read a sector here and write a sector there, because the clustered index or the other indexes are fragmented, that slows everything down. But with a SSD, it doesn't matter because there's no mechanical latency. This armature makes everything slow. With an SSD, it's just electrons, and it can query all these different bits that it needs off of the SSD devices extremely fast. And so we're talking, microseconds, nanoseconds compared to milliseconds for hard disks. When I look at the big benchmarks published by the Transaction Processing Council, well, now they call themselves the Transaction Performance Processing Council, you'll see that the vendors have to declare what kind of hardware they use to achieve these record-breaking benchmark speeds. And in the old days, before SSDs were widely available, they would routinely put in 1,000 hard disks, for example, so that they could hit these really, really high speeds. The last one I looked at before SSDs came out had 968 hard disks and 42 controllers. And that I/O latency, it just evaporates in the face of one or several SSDs. It's just a huge game changer. So don't think about disk just as this expensive thing that provides space. It provides I/O. And one of the things that I see happen all the time is that we do it to ourselves. A conversation between the DBA and the SAN administrator might go along the lines of, hey, we've got a new application that's starting up. I'd like to put it on server XYZ, and I think I'm going to need 50 gigabytes of space to start with, and we'll probably need to grow about 10 gigabytes a quarter. And the SAN admin will say, sure, no problem. I'll go create some LUNs for you. And the DBA never knows that the SAN admin goes and creates a LUN for him that is, striped across 30 disks on a RAID 5 array. That's because nobody thought about this in terms of anything other than disk space. Think about it in terms of I/O load as well, and then you will get much better performance out of your SQL Server systems. All right, so that's number 1, or number 10, I should say, and then let's go down from there. So the next one I see happen all the time is business ignorance. Now, keep in mind, it's a different mistake as an IT professional that you don't know a whole lot about SQL Server. If you don't know these important internals, and these are just a few examples out of many, I don't think we can call you an IT professional. I think we can call you an IT worker, but a professional knows about the internals of their system. A worker just, pushes the levers and turns the knobs. So what are you? I hope you are an IT professional and that you care. One of the interesting things that I've seen in management and business performance research is that the big management consulting firms, corporations like McKinsey and Bain and Boston Consulting Group, one of the most highly performant teams that they have found anywhere are the teams, believe it or not, that are the pit crews for racing. And these teams perform incredibly well. They're very, very efficient. There's just a person whose sole job is to run up to the vehicle with a great big gas tank on their shoulder and, shoot a bunch of gasoline into the tank, and then off they go. That's all they do. But to even get on that team, the people on the pit crew have to know all sorts of things that they don't apply on a regular basis. They have to know what the internals of the internal combustion engine is, and braking systems and suspension systems and all those things. So though they're specialized and they are tasked with one thing, at any given moment they might have to switch to a different duty on the pit crew team, and they can do it. And I would pose the question to you, why is there any difference between you or me as a DBA in a situation like this? We need to know internal processes. We need to know things like checkpoint and lazy writer. We need to know when and how and why tempdb is used. We need to know about the planned cache and the buffer cache and hash buckets and sorts and all those kinds of things, because we're professionals. We care about what we do, and an emergency situation might dictate that we have to actually act on that knowledge. In fact, I would say if you're going to be a DBA for long, you will be acting on that knowledge pretty often. So that's a different error, though. That's a different mistake that DBAs make, is to not know the internals. What I'm actually talking about here is a career opportunity sort of mistake. And so what happens here is that I want to illustrate this with a story. When I was first starting out as a DBA, I had been 6 years as a developer working on Oracle. And I always wondered, why is the DBA getting in the way of me rolling out my code? Things are he's an impediment. He must just be a person who's no fun. And so that was kind of my initial thought. And then later on I became a DBA, and when I experienced my first major meltdown of a server, and it was an expensive server. I can't remember exactly the price. It was somewhere between, say, $60,000 and $100,000 for this server. I was really worried about getting a call from the executives, and I expected the CIO to call me and say, "What happened to my server? What can we salvage from this server?" But instead, I got a call from the CIO, and what he said was, "What happened to my data? How fast can I get my data back up and available?" And to that, I said, well, right away, we're getting it done right now. But the lesson I learned in that story was, what was the asset? So all this time, many years now, I've been working with data, and all that time I had it wrong. I thought that the big expensive hardware was the corporate asset, of this particular enterprise. But in fact, the real thing of value to our corporation was the data. The data was what was really, really valuable. And so when I realized that, I suddenly had a revelation that my job as the DBA was to protect the corporate asset. And the corporate asset in this specific situation, that corporate asset wasn't the hardware, it was the data. And when I had that revelation, I now suddenly understood the behavior of all those other DBAs I'd ever worked with. They weren't being stick in the muds because they were not nice people or anything. They were doing it because their job was to protect what was really valuable to the enterprise. I thought it was hardware, but in fact it was the data. And so they had to make sure that whenever I wrote a program or rolled out a fix, that it didn't do anything to inadvertently alter data, and that it had to be properly checked, and that QA had to, have everything looked at. And so with that in mind, let's take it a step further. So now you understand that as a DBA, you are the guardian of the most important asset in the data center, which is the data. Now here's the next step. Most IT people do not have any linkage, really, between IT and the business. So if you talk to a person who is let's say, the network administrator, doesn't matter to him that he doesn't know what the business is. He doesn't care about that, because TCP/IP packets are packets. Routers are routers, no matter what kind of business it is that he is working for. If you're an exchange administrator, it doesn't matter so much what business your company does. He just wants to make sure that the email goes through. But if you're a DBA, you care a lot about what kind of business you're working for. If you work for a radiology company, a bunch of doctors who do radiology, their business is going to be images. And that image data is enormously different in a SQL Server database than just simple old transactions are, of product and product amount, product ID, product value, quantity and all that stuff. It's entirely different. Blob data is entirely different kind of data. If you work for a floral company, you know what? There's only 2 times of the year that a flower business is super busy, and that's in the run-up to Mother's Day and the run-up to Valentine's Day. And the rest of the year, they're 20% as busy as they are during those 2 seasons. If you're in a tax business, you are busy between January and April 15th in the United States, other times for other tax deadlines around the world. And so it matters a lot. And because you are the person in the enterprise who knows about data and its relationship between the value it offers to the business and its importance as an IT asset, you are in a position to have greater influence over what it is this company does with its IT solutions than anybody else, because you understand the interplay between the two things, or you should. So I've seen many DBAs who couldn't care a whit about the data, and this is a big mistake, and it kind of prevents you from getting promotions later on that you could be getting. DBAs, on the other hand, who do learn about their business, learn things like, what sort of people are using this system, what sort of people are using this system, and why it matters to them, and are there different people who have different degrees of care. Some people might not care a lot, others might care a whole bunch, and so sometimes you can satisfy one group and let the other group, be a little disappointed in order to meet other requirements. You can learn things like, what are the business cycles? I mentioned about long-term cycles, but you should learn during the course of the day, what are the busy times during the day? Is it busy after everybody comes back from lunch and starts to log back in, or in the morning when everyone starts to, connect to the website? Or maybe it's busy at night because it's mostly about processing reports. When are the best times to get your preventative maintenance down? What is normal in terms of performance for your SQL servers? If you don't know what's normal, how can you know what's abnormal? And in fact, I do a whole different set of presentations around performance, baselining, benchmarking, and monitoring, so you can learn what is normal for your systems. So the good news is on that second part, well, you're going to have to learn that yourself. But on the first part, in terms of, do you know all of these internal things? Are you a true IT professional? There are so many great resources out there to help you. SQLpass.org, There's a good kind of series of bloggers that do something called SQL University. There's a good website from Australia called SQL Crunch, SQLblog.com. For example, iBlog, KevinEKline.com. I would recommend you definitely look at some of the Microsoft websites, such as SQL Cat and the MSDN blog for the CSS engineers of the SQL Server team, and also say SQLskills.com and all their blogs. That's one of my favorite websites there. SQLperformance.com is another great one. So you can learn that first set, IT professional skills for you as a DBA. Now, here's a bonus blunder. It's not one of the top 10, but it's related to that kind of professionalism. And so what I'm talking about here is a lot of times I find people who want to figure something out themselves, and so they spend a whole lot of time tinkering around on a very significant, maybe even critical problem, but they don't ask for help. And I kind of get that, because a lot of times many of us are the only DBA in our shop, in our IT shop. So there's not a lot of people there we can talk to. Maybe there's a smart developer. Maybe there's another DBA on a different team. So there may be impediments to us asking. But the flip side is there are these great forums that you can go to. So my favorite is dba.stack, Stack Overflow or stackexchange.com. They are super. Another thing I've seen is there is a right and a wrong time also to ask for support. So if it's a mission critical situation, don't waste time. Even if you don't have a support contract, it's really worth it to spend I'm not sure exactly, $100, $150 to call Microsoft support and get them on it. Because, again, going back to the previous slide, if you know what your business is about, you know that your server being down is worth more than $150 an hour. In fact, you should probably quantify that. That was one of the things I did as I got better at my job as a DBA, is I learned the value of every hour of compute time on all of my servers. So, heck, it's important to go and ask for help on a forum, but if it's critical, you should go straight to the Microsoft support. Make sure you know the value. The other thing I want to point out is that in asking for help, there are some great tools, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about these here with Twitter and SQL Help. But just another thing to keep in mind too, from a career standpoint, it's a great idea to ask someone you respect, someone who's a little bit higher up in the org chart than you, or maybe a lot if you have a good relationship with them, and someone who can kind of help you navigate the political aspects of your career. Now, as I said a moment ago, you can get the technical mentoring online. You don't have to get all of that from someone down the hallway, especially if there's no one available. But myself and many other of the top bloggers in the SQL Server space actively mentor a bunch of people. So people like Brent Ozar and Steve Jones at SQL Server Central, Aaron Bertrand, quite a few others will always be happy to give you advice. Now, let's go back to that idea about SQL Help. What the heck is this? If you don't know what this is, what you're missing out on is kind of an interesting idea. So here's what you need. A lot of people will go and sign up for Twitter, and it's kind of useless because it's this, according to the number of people you follow, you start to get all of their updates, everything they post onto Twitter. And it's just this great big tumble of information that is impossible to sort. Well, what you need to do is download one of the free tools. Here's an example of one that you might want to use called TweetDeck. And there's other ones. I am actually using another one a little more often now called Hootsuite. And so what you can do is you can create these different channels. So over here at the bottom you can see the slider bar, and immediately to the left of what's on the screen is just my whole Twitter feed, which has got all kinds of stuff, comedians and movie quotes, whatever it is I'm interested in. Here's where all the people are talking to me, sending me direct messages and things like that, are talking about me in Twitter, so I can respond to somebody who's made mention of me doing something else somewhere in the Twitter sphere. Here I can keep track of everything that's related to SQL Pass. And then, as I said a moment ago, pound SQL help. So that pound sign, that hashtag, is like your own TV channel. So if you were really into, oh, I don't know, college basketball or NBA, you could do pound NBA, and you would find every tweet that comes along related to the NBA. Or if you like the specific team, you know, in my case, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, I could put, you know, pound Tennessee Titans, the NFL team in town. But as a SQL Server DBA, you could put pound SQL help. And you can throw out a question, just like this person has done here, Jason Horner. Hi, Jason. He's out in Denver. And you're going to get, probably within 5 minutes, you're going to get very, very good quality answers. You're going to get answers from Microsoft MVPs in the SQL Server space, from book authors, from some of the top experts. Many of the top experts out there keep an eye on this hashtag channel and respond if they happen to have a few free moments. So it's a mistake not to ask. The thing you got to do is just ask in the right place. And today, that's what Twitter is. Twitter is kind of like a giant water cooler where everybody with similar interests can get together at one time. So even though you're the only smart SQL person in your building, you can now get in touch and get interaction with many, many other of the smartest people out there. So we've only gone through 8. We're just about to hit number 8 here. So the number 8 biggest mistake is not having a troubleshooting methodology. Now, I'm not saying you need to know all about troubleshooting. What I'm saying is methodology. That means your checklist, right? And I was even talking with one DBA recently, and I said, what's the first thing you do when you have an important troubleshooting situation? And he was serious when he said, I panic. That was the first thing on his checklist. Methodology provides you kind of a stable and predictable way to get your results, your step-by-step process, all the way down to the root cause. You know, you become aware of a problem, you begin to troubleshoot. You know, what are the steps that take you through? If you don't do it, you are gonna get burned in so many different ways. And just me being the sort of person I am, I think one of the worst things about not troubleshooting effectively isn't that, you know, yes, we have problems, you know, we have errors, we have poor response times. Those are all bad. But what's especially bad is when we lose credibility. That's a bad thing, you know. And you want people to think of you as the smartest, most credible person in your organization for SQL Server. So that's when you need to make sure you've got a methodology. The good news is there's 2 really easy ways to do this. The first is I give you kind of in a 1-hour session, just like this session, I've got my end-to-end troubleshooting methodology. And you can see that on SQL SENTRY TV. And the slide decks are there. And so you can see it. It's the one I developed years ago and have been using ever since the 90s. And it's been very, very effective to me. I was really pleased when a friend of mine, a guy named Jonathan Cahias, again, one of the top minds in the SQL Server space, he wrote an ebook for Simple Talk. And well, it's actually a real book too that you can buy. But you can get the ebook for free on simpletalk.com. And the thing that's cool about it is he pretty much agreed with everything I said. So he just went into a lot more detail than I did in my slide deck. So if you want to get the ebook, do that too. And that will put you light years ahead of other DBAs in your shop or IT personnel in your shop. You know, when you think about careers, in a lot of cases, careers are a competitive sort of thing. And if you know how to do this better than someone else, then you're the person who gets the promotion. You get that promotion to lead DBA, whereas they may not. All right, now here's a bonus blunder, and this is not being proactive. Okay, now what do we mean there? Well, this means that you only wait for the phone to ring, you know, for troubleshooting to begin. And in fact, that's a really big mistake, because if you wait for the phone to ring, somebody's already mad. You know, performance is already bad. You know, things, you know, connections are getting dropped. Things are failing. So let me show you a little demo. This is not within SQL Server. So what you need to do at a minimum, if you don't do anything else, is enable a built-in feature inside of SQL Server called error notification. And what happens with error notification is you open up Management Studio, and so when you open up Management Studio, you go over here to the SQL Server agent. Ooh, I'm such a bad drawer. I apologize for that. You open up the SQL Server agent. That's where it's enabled, is under the agent. And then you open up the Alerts tab. And you won't have any alerts in there by default. So you're going to right click on that and you're going to say New Alert. So you want to create a new alert, which will open the dialog box just like I have there. This is a new alert that we're going to create. And at a minimum, you want to go in and create these different new alerts for severity level, SQL Server severity level 18 and above. Now the reason you want to do this for level 18 and above is because at level 18, this is the last of the informational errors. And from 19 on up, something has died. You know, a person has been disconnected, a stored procedure aborted. You know, at levels 23 and 24, a database has been marked as suspect. So something bad has happened at the higher levels. So do that for all of your levels 18 and above. There are also some useful error messages at severity level 17 that are related to deadlocking. However, there's so much noise at level 17 that doesn't make any difference. What I do is for those level 17 ones, I actually will come over here and just create individual error messages for those specific error numbers rather than the whole severity level. So that's one way you can kind of be more selective as you define a specific error number rather than the whole severity level. But at a minimum, do it for the severity level. And so you have the pop-up that appears here. And then the next thing that you want to do, you see here, after you define it, is you come over here to the Response tab, and that will pop open this page that we see on the right. And at least have it send you an error message. As you can see, I've done that here. You could have it page you. You could have it send a net send notification to your workstation. You know, something of that nature. You could even have it execute a transact SQL job. Now, I wouldn't do that for all the operations because, you know, who knows, you know, what specific actions might need to be done depending on what the error is. But for some specific errors, like a backup failed, you might, you know, have a job that retries in a half an hour or something of that nature. So just make sure that you can find out everything that is going on your SQL Server. And be proactive. Have it tell you. Let it work harder for you. Also, one other note. One other type of alert that you can do is over here. You see the SQL Server event alert. There's two other choices under this. There is also performance alerts, and there are WMI alerts. And the performance alert feature is quite neat because you could also use it to in tangent or in cooperation with perfmon counters. So you could tell it to send me an alert when if the buffer cache hit ratio ever drops below 80%, or send me an email if CPU hits 100% for more than a minute. All right, so I got to get moving. There's a lot more left, and I only have 20 minutes left. So another huge mistake that DBAs make, and this is a technical one, is just going with the defaults. And I can understand this one because Microsoft has long kind of promoted and advertised itself as being the easiest of the big relational database platforms to install. And the problem is it is easy to install and get up and running, but the default settings for things like the server level and the database level configuration settings, those are all designed with the least common denominator in mind. And when I say least, I mean really least, like tiny little databases. And most of us in a professional context at least work with multi-gigabyte databases. Maybe you're still working with small hundreds of megabyte databases, but the defaults are like set for 2 megabyte databases and 1 megabyte transaction log, so they're just ridiculously tiny. I have written blog posts about this, as have other great authorities in the field. Paul Randall has written a really good one about it that I encourage you to read. Another person, an expert on SQL Server, is named Thomas Kaiser, who's written about these, but these can be major issues. For example, SQL Server automatically creates file groups, the primary file group, and then it sets the databases to auto grow. And the auto grow size for the database and the transaction log are tiny. They are 2 megabytes for the data file and 1 megabyte for the transaction log. Well, it varies by version of SQL Server, and it also varies because whatever model is set up as will trump any other settings. But one of the interesting things about transaction log files is every time they have to auto grow, it creates what's called a VLF, or a virtual log file. And the more of those there are, the slower the transaction log responds, particularly if you have big, long-running transactions. So if you have more than several hundred VLFs, you're actually going to be able to see the difference in performance. So it's just a bad idea. Many other things like fill factor is a very useful way to ensure that at least your cluster keys and so forth help reduce the amount of page splits that you have happen on your SQL Server. And so fill factor by default is not set up in such a way to reduce page splits. Again, many of the server and database level configurations also are set up in such a way to kind of ease installation and setup, but not configured for performance. All right, number 6. Oh, there it is. So here we've got a transaction log that's 1 megabyte and a database file that's 3 megabytes. But notice this. They grow differently as well. So the data file grows by 1 megabyte, but the transaction log grows by 10%. So that means each time it grows, it's a different number because it's a percentile. And, as the guardian of the corporate asset, one thing we want is stability and predictability. And I don't like trying to figure out what my transaction log is growing as. The best practice, by the way, I didn't mention this before, but the best practice is to create the database and the transaction log file from the beginning at the size you would think it's going to be perhaps for the full first year of operation. And you set the auto grow number, you don't turn it off, but you set the auto grow number to perhaps 20% of that. So let's say you think the database is going to be about 100 gigabytes after the first year. I would go ahead and create a 100 gigabyte primary data file, and then I would create probably about 1/5 the size, a 20 gigabyte transaction log file. And then I would set each of those to auto grow by 1/5 of those values, or 1/4 of those values. So I might set the database to auto grow by 25 gigabytes and the transaction log to grow by a smaller number, let's say 4 or 5 gigabytes, something like that. That way you don't get all these constant incremental growths. And by the way, SQL Server can't process any other transactions until the transaction log is done with its auto grow. So you don't really want that to even fire off in the middle of the day anyway. You don't want it to happen unexpectedly. Of course, I never turn it off, but I like to manage it rather than have it manage me. Now here's a sort of political problem that I see lots of DBAs get stung by. SQL injection. And again, I have another presentation on this. If you're interested in it, drop me an email and I'll send you the slide deck. But SQL injection is the #1 hack on the internet today that causes damage. So it's not the one that is the most numerous. There are things like DDS and man in the middle, all kinds of different things like that are so easy to script out that they happen in the millions of times a day. But SQL injection happens in the hundreds of thousands of times every day, but it actually causes damage. And the funny thing about SQL injection is It works the same on Oracle and SQL Server and MySQL and Postgres and DB2 and it works the same on every major database platform. We've known about it since the beginning of web pages and databases working together, and it still happens as much as it does, to make it the #1 hack that causes damage. It's happening everywhere. And what I often find happen is that DBAs say, well, the developers wrote the application and they wrote the security module for the application, so it's the developer's job. And the developers are thinking to themselves, well, we have a security team here and they control and manage Active Directory, and so security is their job. And the Active Directory guys are over there thinking, hey, the DBAs do this grant and revoke on the database, and they set up logins and users on SQL Server, so it's their job. And then at the end of the day, nobody's done any security work on this system. So I'm not telling you to become a security expert, but I'm saying don't make it an afterthought. If you don't know how this system is being secured, ask some questions, raise some red flags. If your company is insistent on buying a third-party packaged application in which the product needs to use SA every time anyone connects, raise a red flag, because you will get burned at some point, very, very likely. The #5 biggest mistake that DBAs make is inadequate automation. And by this, I mean GUI. So you have two different ways to handle a challenge in SQL Server. The first is you can use the graphic user interface of SQL Server Management Studio to do all of your work. The other way is to write Transact SQL or perhaps PowerShell scripts. Now the thing is, the only way you can really scale out is to not use the GUI, because you're limited on the GUI. You can only be on one GUI at a time. But if you learn how to automate things, you can actually run those scripts on multiple servers at once. And the cool thing is, once you have gotten your script to work perfectly, it always works perfectly, right? Unless maybe there's a version change that you didn't know about and command has changed or something like that. So there have been plenty of times where I've been in the GUI and I accidentally clicked the wrong checkbox and messed something up, because it was 3 in the morning and I was trying to troubleshoot something when I was sleepy. When you've got a script that does that, you don't have to worry about it, because that will work. And it helps cure all kinds of problems that you have to deal with. And a thing that is really great about automation, you find, is that not only can you get a lot more work done, but you have a little bit more peace of mind. You can schedule more jobs to do things for you. And you can also, when you get good at it, you can start to use other scripts that are written by other people to get your work done. So you begin to rely on scripts, but the thing that's cool about that is that there are script libraries all over the place. SQLServerCentral.com, for example, has some great script libraries there. Glenn Berry, a blogger and consultant at SQLskills.com, has a really famous set of scripts called the SQL Server Diagnostic scripts. And then there's a couple others too that I want to let you know about in just a moment. Now, also, if you are using Transact SQL, which is what I have always used, then you do have some limitations. You really can't do a whole lot on the file system unless you're enabling XP command shell. But you can use PowerShell to do all kinds of things with the file system, enabling or disabling a service or checking how many files exist in a folder. And if you don't want to learn PowerShell, or perhaps you don't want to learn WMI, there are a couple free tools you can actually use. PowerGUI, look at powergui.org, and that's a tool that can help you kind of, draw your PowerShell scripts. And then Scriptomatic will do something similar for the WMI sorts of queries that you might want to make. So those are two that will enable you to work smarter and not harder, and not learn a whole new scripting language. All right, let's move on. Number 4. This is one that I did a lot when I was first a DBA. One of the things I loved about being a developer was that I would spend a lot of time thinking about what was new, and so it was really, really neat for me to apply the newest, shiniest feature in the IDE, the Integrated Development Environment, and start using that everywhere. I see that now with, database developers when I see, suddenly a shift in their code from not using CTEs at all. Then you see the day that they have learned how to code a CTE, and so it appears everywhere. But what we find happening is that people will use, particularly, they'll go, shiny, it's a great new feature, I'm going to use it, and they use it everywhere. And the problem is, that's not the best way to solve problems. Remember, as a DBA, you are the guardian of the corporate asset. And your job is to mitigate risk, reduce risk. And so you want to be sure that you are fixing the right problem with the right tool. And that is going to have an emphasis on tried, tested, and true. So, when Service Broker came out back in SQL 2005 days, saw a lot of people using Service Broker when standard transactional replication was a much more effective and reliable resource. Another thought on that, I've seen situations in which a particular feature was shipped by Microsoft, and 1 or 2 releases later, it wasn't there anymore. There's all kinds of things like that. There used to be something called Link for SQL. There used to be something called notification services. There used to be something called English language query. None of those are around anymore. So you should wait a little bit and go with what you know to be tried and tested and true. And one axiom I want to remind you of is there are IT projects. There are business projects, organizational projects that are solved using IT. There are even times when the best feature you can apply is to not use technology. It's to change the people process. So, you're dreaming up this big new application for people to do, all these multiple steps to check out a room, a conference room or something like that. And it's such a small company, we don't need that. All we need to do is, close the door. People are like, oh, I can see from where I sit that the conference room is in use, something like that. Or, have a little chart next to the door that you want to book it a day or two in advance. So sometimes using the wrong feature or technology can make things a lot worse than using one that's better suited for the situation at hand. All right. Number 3, biggest mistake I see DBAs make is apathy about change management. And this is really, really important. There are all kinds of situations, from application development, a dev team rolling out new changes, to a patch that comes out from the vendor, to a Microsoft patch, that if you don't pay attention to what you're doing and you're kind of like, I don't know. If you don't pay attention to it, you can really hurt yourself. You can implement a change that leaves things broken, leaves them much worse than they started. And then you have to roll back. But the problem was you weren't even thinking about change management in the first place. And so you don't have an easy way to roll back. And so you have to do this kind of piecemeal rollback in which you restore the database on another server and start pulling back the things that have changed. And it just makes things really difficult. And because you haven't been thinking about, let's say, patches, for example, the servers are different. One server has one version and another server has a different point version than all the rest. It's like, why is this one giving me so many problems? And I have to support it all the time and fix it all the time. Well, it turns out it's one service pack behind because no one has been paying attention to how many patches and changes have been implemented on that server. Now, there is a big difference between change control and change management. Change control, I kind of think of as, at least for dev teams, is the minimum. I want that dev team to have a change control process in place, and that means version control. They can upgrade to a new version in one atomic operation, and they can roll it back if we need to. Change management is a little more involved than that. Change management can include patch management, making sure you have an inventory of all your servers But it also can include some kind of political things as well. You might have a stakeholder change management board in which they can say, we have a go or no go decision on a big change because this particular set of SQL servers includes SQL Server, but they also touch the SharePoint servers, and that's owned by a different team. So the two teams together have to make that decision, whether it's a go forward or a go back. Now, number 2 on the list, inadequate preventative maintenance. And this grows out of that earlier problem I told you about with the going with the defaults. SQL Server doesn't back up databases by default. It doesn't rebuild indexes by default. It doesn't, sort or keep the statistics. It doesn't sort clustered indexes and fill factors and keep those properly applied. So there's all kinds of things that we need to do on a regular basis, such as to do a regular database consistency check. And one of the things that's funny about DBCC is that you can back up a database that won't pass a DBCC check, but you cannot restore one. Things like fragmentation, fill factor, index statistics. It's very common to see indexes become very stale, and the queries get worse and worse and less effective over time. And very often when I'm speaking at an event like, Tech Ed or something like that, I'll have people say, when we first set up the SQL Server, it was so fast, and it's just gotten slower and slower and slower over time. And I'll ask, well, tell me about your preventative maintenance schedule. And the person will look at me and say, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'll say, well, what we need to do is, start by updating the statistics. When SQL Server implements its auto-update statistics algorithm, the statistics on the index have to have changed at least 20%. And there's, plenty of databases that are so big that a 20% change in a particular table is massive. Millions and millions of records. So you could be running a long time with really bad index statistics. Also, just a word of warning, don't rely on the database maintenance wizard if you're running on one of the versions that has the wizard. You script it out with Transact SQL always. That's my advice to you. In fact, a bonus blunder, which has a nice solution, is that you're going to try and write all these scripts yourself, and you really don't have to. There have been some excellent scripts written by 2 other MVPs, if you will. SQL Fool is Michelle Uford, and Michelle is one of the lead DBAs at GoDaddy. And then Ola Hallengren has perhaps the most popular set of preventative maintenance scripts out there for SQL Server. They're both free in both cases. And the big difference between them is that Ola's has some scripting in there that supports many of the major third-party backup or recovery tools from independent vendors like Lightspeed from Dell Software. All right, just a few minutes left, and we've just hit the number 1 mistake that DBAs make. And that is that backups do not equal recovery. I know lots of DBAs who, and I've talked to many DBAs in a panic, who have a great backup system, but they don't test those backups. And the problem is, you don't know if you can recover until you actually recover your backup file. This causes all kinds of different problems. If you don't test your recovery regularly, you won't know if you can meet your SLA, your time objective, your your recovery point objective, your recovery time objective. You won't know if your backups are good. Like I said, you can back up a database that can't pass a DBCC check, but you can't restore one. There are situations in which I had actually done restores, and I didn't realize that the application, which was also housed on the same server as the SQL Server, it has different DLL requirements than SQL Server itself did. And so I needed to install additional DLLs for that. And I didn't know that until the users started to reconnect, and they called me back and said, hey, your database is still not working. And I said, it's working perfectly. I said, no, it's not. And sure enough, it turns out that it needed different DLLs. Also, a lot of times people don't remember that Let's say if I have a database that crashes, let's say my MSDB database crashes, and so I recover it. Well, that's great, but what if another database I had, an application database I had, added a new job between the time that I last took a backup of MSDB? I might not have all of the databases backed up that I need because I need both the application database and MSDB. So lots of problems with that. You really need to not think of backups as a discrete thing. Think of backups as your means of doing recovery. And in fact, the backups are the only situation in which I have known a guy to lose his job as a DBA because he didn't do it right. I got a call from a person who was desperate for help, and I could hear, the CIO yelling in the background, and, what do you mean you can't recover this very important mission critical database? Just go home. I don't even want you here. Just go home. And yeah, it's terrible. But so what we did in our situation is we actually implemented a routine that would automatically recover some of our databases directly over to a dev box. And one of the things that's really empowering about that is the next time you have a failure and you have to recover on a mission critical database, and this actually happened to me, you're going to get executives in there who are pacing back and forth, sweating bullets, waiting for your system to come back up. And if you've never done a recovery test, you're just waiting with them. But if you have done a recovery test, especially if you've done one recently, you can tell them, you know what, we recover on a regular basis. We've tested it, and the last time we did the recovery last weekend, it took 45 minutes. Why don't you come back in 35 minutes, 30 minutes, and you don't have to stick around here except for the last couple minutes. And they're like, really? Oh, okay, thank you. And off they go. And I don't know about you, but I feel much better in a troubleshooting situation when an executive is not pacing around red-faced and sweaty in my cube. I want them to go and do their thing and then come back when everything's okay. The idea is that as a DBA, and really as an IT person, it's all about the data. All the time, every time. That's what's important. So I tend to, still get other things in the way, but that is the important thing. So that's the number one mistake. Start to work on a way to make your recoveries happen automatically so that you are in control anytime there's a major crash. All right, a few things about summarizing. Only a few big blunders are due to tech skills. Those are things like disk space, the troubleshooting methodology, and just going with the defaults. But most of the others are due to process or business issues. Things like security as an afterthought, using the wrong features, change management, preventive maintenance and automation, and backup doesn't equal recovery. Those are all process or attitude or thought process problems. And you can see it's a much bigger list. A couple resources to help you out. I mentioned in passing SQL Cat, the customer advisory team, fantastic website. That website has actually moved to MSDN. Paul Randall and all of the bloggers at SQL Skills. Those are the most authoritative voices in the business. SQLperformance.com is outstanding. And I always encourage folks to join for free. There's no cost, but join SQLpass.org as well. And I'm sorry I don't have time to get to any questions today. It's good to see many of you online. Many of you are friends, folks I know personally. If you do have a follow-up question, please do send it to me via email, and I will respond, and I will put the questions into a Q&A log file that we'll upload onto SQL Sentry TV. So if you want to read questions others had, or see your own question up there on the web, you can look for it on SQL Sentry TV. It usually takes us about 2 weeks to get the presentation posted up there. So I hope that's valuable to you, and I hope you've learned a lesson from my mistakes, so that you don't have to face any of those mistakes yourself. And I hope that this was good for you. So thanks very much. Hope to see you at the next webcast. Bye-bye.